This is the high-end Moto Edge 30 Pro, also known as the Motorola Edge Plus 2022 in the US. Moto's flagship Edge series is nothing new, but this one looks like it could be the most promising one yet. I'm Will for GSM Arena, and let's see what the Edge 30 Pro has to offer in our full review. The Moto Edge 30 Pro is a flagship phone that brings quite a few changes feature-wise compared to the previous model. As far as design goes though, it's very similar. This isn't a small phone, and I do like the finish here. It's matte and pearlescent, reflecting light into different colors. The Gorilla Glass 5 back tapers into the frame, but that frame is plastic this year, not metal. Moto phones generally bring some splash proofing, but this time it's official. IP52 rated dust and splash resistance. The Edge 30 Pro's display is very similar to the 20 Pro's. It's a 6.7-inch OLED with a 1080p resolution and an extra fast 144Hz refresh rate. 144Hz is faster than most rivals, which you generally find at 120. This means that this display is even smoother and more fluid looking when swiping around. In the 144Hz mode, it'll be locked at this refresh rate for most activities. Or you can switch to the auto mode, which will dial down to save energy, but it maxes out at 120Hz. Besides the refresh rate, another special feature of this display is stylus support, like what you'd get on Samsung's Galaxy S22 Ultra. It's not as well integrated though. You'd have to buy a Moto stylus separately, and there's no dock for it on the phone. The display itself isn't the sharpest around, but it's enough at 393 ppi. It's quite contrasty thanks to the OLED technology, and there's HDR10+ support and 10-bit color too, just like last year. Colors are pretty accurate, especially if you take the time to tweak them in settings. This isn't the brightest panel we've seen, especially for a flagship. It's still decent though. We measured around 485 nits maximum with a manual slider, and this can boost up to 685 nits in auto mode when in bright conditions. And rather than an under-display solution, the Edge 30 Pro's fingerprint reader is built into the power button on the side. It's responsive, but positioned a bit too high for comfy use. Unlike the Moto Edge 20 Pro's single speaker, the Edge 30 Pro has a pair of stereo speakers with Dolby Atmos support. The phone was able to score very good on our loudness chart, and sound quality is solid too. You can get the Edge 30 Pro with 128, 256, or 512 gigs of storage on board. This isn't expandable though. The Edge 30 Pro's interface is what they call MyUI, based on Android 12. It brings a very stock look and feel, similar to what you'd get on a Google Pixel, and that's especially noticeable up in the notification shade. You do get Moto's special functions as well, which are accessed through the Moto panel, and they're pretty much the same as what we've seen on previous devices. There's also support for Moto's Ready 4, which allows you to connect the phone to a TV, monitor, or even a PC. That's great for things like casting media, multitasking, and video calls. While the previous model had a flagship killer chipset rather than a top-tier one, the Edge 30 Pro isn't holding back. It brings the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 that you'd find in this year's other Android flagships. Benchmark performance is chart-topping, as you'd expect, both CPU and GPU-wise. Both everyday tasks and heavy games run great on the Edge 30 Pro, and when it comes to thermal throttling, it does a surprisingly decent job too. One of the more underwhelming features of the Moto Edge 30 Pro is its battery life. It has a 4800 mAh battery, which is larger than last year's model, but its battery scores were much lower in our tests. Overall, the Edge 30 Pro earned an endurance rating of just 80 hours. The global version of the phone ships with a 68-watt fast charger, but the US version only gets a 30-watt one. With the large adapter, we were able to charge the Edge 30 Pro from 0 to 85% in half an hour. And it's USB power delivery adapted, so you can fast charge other devices too. Onto the cameras. The Edge 30 Pro has a 50-megapixel main cam with a large sensor, OIS, and omnidirectional autofocus, a 50-megapixel ultra-wide with autofocus, and a depth sensor. You missed out on the periscope telephoto of last year, which is a bummer. Anyway, photos from the main camera are very good, though perhaps not on the same level as other flagships. You get low noise, pleasant color saturation, and excellent detail. The rendering of fine detail sometimes leaves more to be desired though. Moto has also gone for a contrasty look, which means that some shadows and highlights are on the harsher side. The Edge 30 Pro has to rely on a digital crop from the main cam for zooming. These are relatively soft and have some visible noise, like in the skies. Portrait shots are decent. Subject separation is excellent for simpler scenes, though it can be fooled by busy backgrounds or messy hair. Photos from the ultra-wide aren't amazing, but they're pretty good. They have low noise and a solid amount of detail. We're not huge fans of the dull colors though, and the dynamic range isn't that wide. Since the ultra-wide camera has autofocus, you can use it to take close-ups, and these have much better detail than those dedicated macro cams you see on a lot of mid-range phones. There's also a macro mode, which applies digital zoom to get even closer. These are still decent, but you lose some sharpness and detail. In low light, the main cam is capable, but again not at the level we've seen from competing flagships. There's plenty of detail and noise levels are okay. Colors are a bit muted though, and while dynamic range isn't bad, the shadows are darker than we'd like. Night mode brings some noticeable but subtle changes. The biggest benefit is that clipped highlights are restored. Shadows are also a bit better, but you don't get much more detail in dark areas. Some textures and fine details generally get smoothed out too. The ultra-wide's low-light photos are okay. They're soft and colors are desaturated, but dynamic range could be worse. Night mode brings a number of improvements. You get a sharper image overall with brighter shadows and better contained highlights. The Edge 30 Pro's front-facing cam has a high-resolution 60-megapixel sensor. Selfies come out at 15 megapixels by default, and they have great detail and low noise. Dynamic range is nicely wide too, but colors can be a little too conservative, especially in indoor scenes. The Edge 30 Pro can record video in up to 8K resolution at 30 FPS with its main camera. The 8K footage is actually quite decent. Although it's not the sharpest we've seen, there's plenty of detail, and we like the exposure, colors, and the dynamic range. 4K footage from the main cam is also good. It maintains the nice colors and dynamic range of the 8K videos, and the detail level is excellent. For some reason, the ultra-wide cam maxes out at 1080p resolution. The quality is fine, but it could use some extra pop in both colors and contrast. There's electronic stabilization available on the main cam at up to 4K, and it does a decent job in combating shakiness, though it does seem a bit floaty. Turning on the stabilization with the ultra-wide seems to drop the image quality quite a bit. So that's the Moto Edge 30 Pro, or Motorola Edge Plus 2022. Compared to last year's model, you get stylus support on the display, stereo speakers, a top-notch chipset, and faster charging. But the problem is it's not all upgrades here. The battery life is lackluster, while the Edge 20 Pro's was pretty good, and you're also missing the telephoto cam now. So in the end, if you really want those new features, then the Edge 30 Pro is worth recommending, but otherwise there are other options to consider. Thanks for watching guys, stay safe and see you on the next one.